So, good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. Good evening, depending on wherever you're from. Welcome to Singapore. My name is Imran, and this is the Singapore 101, a brief introduction. This stemmed from many of the kind of questions that people had and were putting to me during my various walkabouts, particularly the Not Crazy Rich Asians tour, where I showed people a little bit about public housing and my own neighborhood. I think Singapore is a country that many other countries have uh, tried to emulate in terms of its development. And so I thought it might be good to really give a little bit of a brief introduction to those of you who are interested. Firstly, if you have not been on a tour with me before, I have basically been a guide for many years now, almost a decade here in Singapore. However, prior to that, I worked in the banking industry for over 20 years. And I have had the privilege of living and working and studying in many countries around the world, including in the US, UK, the Middle East, and of course, my place of birth, which is Pakistan. And I moved to Singapore in 1997 and have lived here ever since. So this is home for me. And with that, I also want to say that let's keep this a conversation. The way I have structured this is I have created a few slides. Hopefully, I will not spend more than 20 minutes to half an hour giving you a little bit of background on Singapore. And then after that, we can open it up to everyone for questions. Of course, if you have questions or comments during the slides, please feel free to share them. Also, please note that I will be looking down at my notes from time to time. So please, I do apologize for the loss of eye contact from time to time, but I want to make sure that I give you the correct facts. Also, I have tried to be as I will try to be as fair and objective as possible, but of course, my opinions will come through, but I'm sure all of you will be able to sift through what is my opinion and what is my fact. All right, so the camera's a little bit of an angle. It's not because I tried to find the most photogenic way to minimize the size of my nose. It's just simply because I wanted to make sure I had my notes in front of me. All right, so let's begin. So again, welcome everyone. Those of you who are just joining, this is SG 101. I'm going to give you a brief history of Singapore and of course be here to answer all your questions. So let's start with an image that many of you may have already seen, but is very good for putting things into perspective. Singapore is known as the little red dot, and it is very, very little. It's about 700 square kilometers in size. You can see how small it is. East to west, 1.25 marathons, north to south, less than half a marathon. That means that we probably fit in the size of New York and smaller than LA County, depends how you size the cities. We have 5.4 million people living on this small island. But as an aside, how did we get the name Little Red Dot? Singapore is in Southeast Asia. North of us is Malaysia, and all around us are Indonesian islands. And back in the last century, some of you may recall when President Suharto was president of Indonesia, and then there was a little bit of civil upheaval, and they got there was a revolution essentially. Suharto was overthrown. A new president came in. His name was B.J. Habibie. And at the time, he felt that Singapore was in some way interfering with the internal affairs of Indonesia. So he summoned the Singapore ambassador to his office, and he brought him in and he showed him a map of Southeast Asia. And he said, now this is the Indonesian president talking to the Singaporean ambassador. And he said, you see this entire expanse, and I paraphrase, this entire expanse, all these islands, this big thing on the map here, that is Indonesia. And you see this little red dot over here? That is Singapore. So Singapore, please remember your place. Now, Singapore, being Singapore, we took this as a as a badge of honor, and since then we have been very happily calling ourselves the little red dot. So that's where the word came from. You ask about the population of Singapore. It's 5.4 million today, and we will get into all that as we go along. But let me also just show you a few other slides. This is really the transformation that we're talking about. We're talking about a Singapore in the 60s and 70s that was very much like a third world city, of course. It had basic infrastructure. It was perhaps more developed than many other emerging market cities, but basically it was crowded, it was dirty, it was polluted, and it had all the issues that any third world city had. So how did we go from one to the other? And this shows you how Singaporeans lived. Kampongs. Kampong is the Malay word for village. Malay is was the lingua franca for Southeast Asia until the 60s or 70s. So everyone spoke Malay, irrespective of whether their mother tongue was Chinese or Tamil, or if you were educated in Western education system, English. Everyone lived in kampongs like this. And of course, now we've gone to HDBs. HDB is the acronym for Housing and Development Board, which is the government agency that is responsible for establishing and constructing public housing in Singapore. So this is the transformation that has literally taken place in the last 50 years. Kampongs to HDBs. Look at the kampong, the picture on the left, the black and white one. To move people from kampongs to these apartment blocks was quite easy for the younger generation. The younger generation saw these apartment blocks, they saw modernity, they saw that, well, we're going to have stable electricity, we're going to have piped water, we are going to be in a neighborhood where there will be public transport, so on and so forth. So they were quite happy to move. However, the older generation and that generation that has basically lived their entire life in kampongs, many of them mixed meaning ethnically and religiously, they were not so happy because suddenly they said, you're taking me from this open space where my chickens run wild, where my pigs are roaming, where if my child is going to fall into a well, I know someone else in the village is going to help them. If I fall sick, there'll always be people around me to take care of me. And now you want to take me and put me in these little pigeonholes, shoe boxes, these apartments where I will be stuck inside. No, thank you. I don't want to go. So for the older generation, this transformation was a little bit difficult, required a little bit of coaxing. And that, of course, is also where the issue of having some subsidies and having some incentives to move came in. So the move was not always as easy as we may have realized. I'm going to show you one. I'm going to keep using slides here so that you can also visualize some of what is going on. So this is a timeline for Singapore and its history. While I'm going to focus on its modern history, it's important to put the context in. So 1299, a Sumatran prince. Sumatra is the main Indonesian island near Singapore. He lands on an island which at the time was called Temasek. Temasek is the word for sea town, in Old Javanese. Java is the other language. In fact, the other island, the one on which Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is based. And this is also where I'll tell you the story about how Singapore has got its name, because at the time it was Temasek. He lands on this island, this Sumatran prince, and he is basically surrounded by his courtiers, his ensemble, and he's moving around trying to figure out where to start his settlement because he wants to expand his kingdom and his influence. As he's moving around, he sees a beautiful animal in the distance. So he nudges his advisor, one of his advisors, and says, "Hey, what is that animal?" Now remember, this is the 13th century. As an advisor, you give an incorrect answer, it's your head. It's not just losing your job, it's losing your head. So this guy who is very nervous is thinking, well, what is that animal? I really don't know. So he's thinking to himself, well, the only animal fit for a king is a lion. So he tells the prince, "Sir, it's a lion, your majesty." Sang Nila Utama, the prince, turns around and says, "Okay, henceforth I will call this city the Lion City." Singa means lion in an old language that was prevalent at the time called Sanskrit. Pura means town, city, settlement. So Singapura. And of course, then it was anglicized to Singapore, and that's why we are the Lion City. So he lands here in 1299, and he builds a trading hub in Singapore. So Singapore starts to develop some characteristics of what it is today. It starts to trade with the region because in this part of the world, Southeast Asia, we have essentially the Malay archipelago, lots of islands, lots of people who are trading with each other, lots of seafarers. Most of them are what we today call indigenous Malays. Malay as in the Malay people, Malaysia, even Indonesia, to some extent, we can categorize them in the same ethnicity. And they spoke variations of the same Malay language. So we know, based on excavations that we have done in Singapore, that this trading was happening with China, with Siam, Thailand, Vietnam, all this part of the world. So Singapore is already establishing itself as a trading hub. Anyway, there are politics come in, wars, etc. At some stage, the ruling dynasty moves north to Malacca in Malaysia. Some of you may have done virtual tours visiting Malacca. And they take this role of Singapore's regional trading hub to Malacca. In 1819, the English start to set up in Singapore. Now, Singapore's location in the world means that if you are trading from China in the east to India or Europe in the west, the most logical sea route is past Singapore. And at this time, when trading was being done using seafaring vessels, so sail, wind power, Singapore's location became very strategic. It meant that anyone who's trading from China to India or vice versa, and remember, until the 1800s, indeed, until colonialism really established itself, these were the two biggest economies in the world. And then further on, you had the Arab world, the Islamic Empire, and then Europe. And the trade route was running through the Arab world, through Constantinople, into Europe. So Singapore's status as a trading hub really was very apparent, and its location, strategic location, was very apparent. So enter Raffles, Sir Stamford Raffles. He sees that the Dutch have already taken over most of what is today Indonesia. Why did they do that, and why was there European colonial interest in Southeast Asia? Spices. Today we think of spices, maybe we think of nutmeg and cocktails, maybe we think of salt and pepper. We don't really give spices the same importance as it had in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries onwards. At that time, spices were kind of like oil or energy. Countries went to war to maintain supply lines of spices. Adventurers went seeking their fortunes, looking for spices and trading spices. Now, until the 16th century, the spice trade, which was primarily coming from many of the spice islands in today's Indonesia, going west, that was monopolized by the Arabs. The Arabs controlled it, and they tried all sorts of tricks to keep it in their control, keep that monopoly. One trick, they didn't share maps, of course. So the Portuguese, who were the first seafarers to map out this part of the world, they were told that, look, if you go beyond this little island or this little ridge, you will encounter these monsters that live in the sea. So very dangerous. If you don't know what you're doing, you just let us manage it. We'll be doing it okay. We know how to deal with these monsters and dragons. Think Sinbad the Sailor and all the various monsters and all the demons and things that he had to deal with during his voyages. So Sinbad, of course, was an Arab who is from present-day Oman. And you can see him as part of that legacy or that heritage of seafarers, traders that were here in this part of the world. So back to spices. Spices were the thing of wars. And I'm going to give you an example of how important spices were by talking to you about three of them. Because spices had essentially three different uses at the time, and even today. So we think of medicinal use at a time when medicine was not the way it is today. We think of dietary use, so it's a simple one. Think about salt, pepper, how we use it and chilies to flavor our foods, and of course cosmetic use. So before you had plastic surgery and plastic surgeons and even simple things like shampoos and soaps, people were using derivatives from many of these plants and spices. Medicinal, the best example that I can give you is clove. Even today, cloves, many of you may know that if you have a toothache and you can't get an appointment with your dentist, best thing to do, chew on a clove because it's a natural analgesic, a natural pain reliever. So cloves for medicinal use, salt and pepper for dietary use, and particularly important at a time when there was no electricity, no refrigeration. You didn't want to throw away food, even if it was slightly off. So you do what I do. If you've been on any of my walkabouts in Little India or Chinatown, you know I take you into these hawker centers or coffee shops. Well, if I go into a hawker center and I'm trying a new stall, I've never eaten the food there before, I know I have only about half an hour to eat before my next engagement. The food turns out to be horrible. What do? I drown it in chili and just force myself to eat it. So it's similar. At the time, food might be a little bit off. You don't want to throw it away. You may not like the flavor. Just drown it in some pepper or salt or something, whatever taste you desire, and eat it. And we'll worry about the consequences later, right? So, yes, of course, salt as a preservative, Peter, absolutely. So they would use that. So again, it's the importance of these spices in dietary uses. And the third one, cosmetic. Now, we have a plant here that's called a ginger, and I can give you many examples of it. It was very common. If you squeeze that ginger plant, you get a sap that is quite sweet. It was very common in this part of the world to use that sap as a soap or even as a shampoo. So before you had Procter & Gamble and Unilever and Dove and all these other types of cosmetics, you had ginger sap. So this is what drove the European colonials to this part of the world. Raffles was an officer of the East India Company, and he saw that the Dutch, who were their arch rivals, had taken over most of Southeast Asia. And thank you very much, those of you who are being very generous by leaving tips. So he saw that the Dutch had taken over most of these Spice Islands and he wanted to raise the Union Jack. So he looks at a map. He's already based in Southeast Asia. He speaks Malay, which remember is the lingua franca of the region. He speaks Malay. He finds the little red dot, Singapore, on the map. He sees a strategic location and he says, this is where I want to set up the East India Company's trading post. At the time, Singapore, the island, was part of the Kingdom of Johor, the Sultanate of Johor, which is the neighboring province in Malaysia. So he comes here in all his fine colonial livery, and he brings with him 2 other vessels, including some soldiers or sailors. And he lands in Singapore and he asks to meet the king. Now, here is where the colonial tricks start to come into play. The Dutch, they had plucked out the younger son because, let me take a step back. When normally in this part of the world, as in most other parts of the world, when the king dies, the throne is left to the eldest son. The previous king of Johor had 2 sons. And the Dutch, in order to cement their influence and control over Johor, they plucked out the younger son and said, hey, you take the throne because your elder brother, we don't really think he's king material and you can do a much better job. So you go ahead, take the throne. Don't worry. We're going to be behind you all the way. We've got soldiers. We've got trading vessels, everything at your disposal. You do us a favor and we'll do you a favor back. So the elder son is sent into exile and Raffles then comes in here. Raffles tells the village headman that I want to meet the real king, not the pretender to the throne, not the one that the Dutch have put into the throne. I want to meet the real king because I want to have a discussion with him. So they take a few days. The real king is probably on an island around here in this part of the world. And after 3 days, the real this son finds his way to Singapore. Raffles tells him, hey, the Dutch, they're very, very bad people. Look at what they did to you. You should have been the king and now you're living in poverty, in exile. You have no kingdom. But don't worry. I'm British. We believe in justice, fair play. And if you stick around long enough, we'll even teach you cricket. Okay? So you stick with me and I'm going to do right to you. And what I want is I will install you as the real king. And in return, you just sign on the dotted line over here. And what we'll do is we'll just set up a little bit of a trading post on the shores of Singapore. All right? And if you're worried, don't worry about how you're going to live. We're going to build you a palace in the middle of Singapore, which today is called the Istana. And Mr. Village Headman, you stick with us. We're going to pay you a pension too. So don't worry. So, of course, this man who's living in poverty in an island in exile suddenly sees the British. And he says, yeah, let's go for it, man. You're right. I should be the king. So where do I sign? Where do I sign? Sign me up for this. And so the British and the new Sultan of Johor, Singapore rather, sign. And the East India Company is established itself in Singapore. Now the Dutch, they tell the English, you can't do this. This is part of our kingdom. And to set up a new king, to install a new king, no way. We are not going to accept this. For 5 years, there's a paper war, diplomatic paper war. Remember, 5 years is not a long time in the 1800s because diplomacy had to be done in writing. There were no tweets. You couldn't conduct diplomacy by Twitter. You also couldn't send emails or let alone faxes. You had to do it the old-fashioned way. So for 5 years, they're exchanging diplomatic messages, but they never went to war. Why did they not go to war? Well, two main reasons. Singapore is a little red dot. Everyone said, it's so small. Really, is it worth going to war over? The Dutch felt they had all the spices they needed anyway. The second reason, 1800s, early 1800s, Europe was warred out. The Napoleonic Wars had been taking place. They'd been fighting each other for the last God knows how many decades, and they didn't feel like another war over this little island that no one could even find on a map at the time, even today, is worth it. So 1824, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty is signed, and the East India Company cements its presence in Singapore. What does Singapore do? The East India Company do? They basically open it up to business. They basically say anyone who wants to come and do business in Singapore, you are welcome to do business. We won't tax you. We won't place onerous duties on you and so on. Just come, do your business, bring your business here. And that is the development of Singapore's concept of the free port, which we are still following today, which means that basically you make it as easy for anyone to come here and do business. The only difference between independent Singapore and the colonial Singapore is that if you try and do business in opium, which was the biggest business during the colonial period, these days, you're probably going to face capital punishment. You're going to be hung. So other than opium, you are free to do business in whatever you want. This was the beginning of Singapore's role as a trading hub. And this is where we then get into the colonial era, and we can then talk about rubber industry in the growth of Singapore. Rubber was invented, and Malaya became one of the was discovered. I shouldn't say invented, it was discovered. And Malaya, which is today's Malaysia, became a major source of rubber for the world, such that by 1900s, almost half of the world's rubber was coming from this part of the world. And that was using Singapore as a port to transport it. The British also built a rail line that brought this rubber down to Singapore, and it was from here that it was being sent all over the world. That is also when all the businessmen in today's Singapore, at the time, established themselves in Singapore and did their trading and merchant operations from here. So Singapore, which had very limited natural resources of its own, particularly because of its size, started to become this trading entrepot, and that is what has stayed with us today. Also of importance during this time is the fact that when the British colonials opened up Singapore to the world, we started to receive heavy numbers of migrants from different parts of the world, particularly India and China. And I will show you what is today's ethnic composition of Singapore. It is 3/4 Chinese, 15% Malay, 10% Indian. At the time that the British came in 1819, there were 0 Indians in Singapore. There were about 95% of the population that was Malay, and there were maybe 2-3% that were Chinese. In other words, the migration from southern China was so intense that the entire demographic complexion of Singapore changed to becoming a Chinese majority city. And this is something that also plays into the independence movement that took place in the 1960s. Along with this ethnic composition is the very diverse religious composition that starts to appear. Now, these numbers I'm giving you are numbers from recent numbers, contemporary numbers, but you can see how the religious angle also comes into play here. That Singapore basically very diverse ethnically as well as religiously. Now, of course, there are many, many subgroups within that. So the British come, they stay, they stick around. World War II happens. Singapore's occupied by the Japanese. Singapore is renamed Seonanto, or Light of the South. And during this time of about 4 years, just under 4 years, when Singapore is occupied by the Japanese, it is a very difficult period for Singapore. Singapore, there's a shortage of food. The Japanese are not too kind to the locals, particularly the Chinese, given the fact that the Chinese are supporting independence movements in mainland China. So, bad time. World War II ends 1945, and the British basically say, okay, fine, the war's ended. We're coming back to Singapore. Don't worry, Singaporeans, we're going to handle everything. However, the Singaporeans had felt that let down by the colonial authorities during the war. They were told that Singapore is an impregnable fortress. It is the Gibraltar of the East, and Singapore will not be taken by the Japanese. However, it was. And in fact, one of the key pillars of Singapore's defense by the colonials was a naval base in Sembawang, northern Singapore. And I do a walk through the Sembawang Park, which is located on the area on which the naval base was built during the 1930s. It's now being turned into a park, although there is also a shipyard there as well that is still functioning. After the Second World War, the locals basically have their own idea, and they say, okay, well, we want self-rule. And to cut a long story short, after a lot of shenanigans and a lot of politics and so on, Singapore obtains its independence in 1965. Now, in between that, a few very important things happen, which are on that timeline that I want to refer you to. 1960, the Housing and Development Board is established. That is the HDB. So public housing becomes an important policy area for the government. It is established by the then Chief Minister of Singapore, who later on became the first Prime Minister of Singapore, called Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Many of you may know the name. And in 1963, the Singapore authorities under Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and another individual, the finance minister, established the Jurong Industrial Estate to pursue export-led growth. Singapore looked at the post-World War II world. Remember, there's a Cold War. It's basically the Soviet Union and the US, the free world and the communist world. China was Red China. India was allied with the Soviet Union. So Singapore looked at the world and saw who has done well after the Second World War. Three nations stood out: Japan, West Germany, there wasn't a united Germany at the time, and Italy. And how did these three countries move forward economically? They did it using export-led growth. So Singapore said, we are going to go down that path ourselves. We're too small. We don't have gold. We don't have oil. We don't have natural resources. We need to bring people into Singapore to invest, set up factories. And that was what the idea of the Jurong Industrial Estate was. So 1965 then, Singapore gains full independence. It's a traumatic time for Singapore. It's not a time for celebration. Why? Because Singapore has been separated from its conjoined twin of the last 500-600 years, which is Malaysia. And Singapore is suddenly left on its own, without natural resources, without an army, without its own police force, and it has to start from scratch. It doesn't even have access to fresh water, which is coming in through a pipeline from Malaysia. So Singapore is basically traumatized because we don't know how we are going to move forward. 1968, the central provident fund, which is used for retirement and for purchase of public housing, is transformed so that people who want to buy their HDB public housing apartments, they can use their retirement money, which they are saving every month from their salaries, to do so. And in 1970, national service is established. There is a shortage of people joining the military. Singapore's culture, remember, is one of merchants and businessmen. Everyone wants to make money. And today we do it in a very low tax environment, but everyone is about here to make money. No one wants to join the military. Very few people. So in order to overcome this shortage of manpower, the Enlistment Act and national service is established, which means that all able-bodied males uh, at the age of approximately 18 must spend 2 years doing national service. National service means they get 6 months of basic military training and then 1.5 years in either the Navy, the Air Force, the military, the police, or the Civil Defense Force, which are like your first responders. Now, that's the background, but let's tell you what Singapore has achieved in the last, say, 50 years. So these are some of the numbers you can look at. So population, we've more than doubled. And note that this population of today's 5.5, it's actually 4.47, something like that, million. Note that it contains 30% foreign citizens. So only 70% are Singaporeans and permanent residents, which are similar to your green card holders. Look at the per capita income. If you look at the per capita income on a purchasing power parity basis, Singapore's per capita income will shoot up to maybe 90 or 100,000. Life expectancy, I've put in the sovereign funds there. There are two sovereign funds that Singapore has. Basically, these are savings for a rainy day, which came in very, very useful during the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic, when the government doled out a lot of support to local citizens to keep their businesses going and to keep people afloat, particularly during the peak of the pandemic. These sovereign funds now have 1.2 trillion US dollars in savings. And this is not a oil-rich country. So Singapore has had to save this through the hard work of its people and basically being very prudent in how they have moved forward with their development. Unemployment and inflation, the last number, owned housing. That is critical because 88% of people live in owner-occupied housing. What happens when people live in owner-occupied housing? They have a stake in the society. Suddenly, the community is one that they are a part of and that they want to make sure it continues, not just developing, but it's harmonious. So despite the different religions, despite those ethnicities, everyone has to get along and treat this diversity as a strength. And of course, this means that people also feel a part of the entire country, the city state. And this development that you see, particularly in per capita income, very important with the social contract that Singapore has had with its government over the last 50 years. Singapore is a parliamentary democracy. We have elections every 5 years. And for the last, since independence, in fact, the same ruling party has been voted in by different margins in every election. But the question that I put to you is, if you have a government that has developed Singapore the way that these numbers show to you, where you own your own home, where your per capita income now puts you in the top 5 wealthiest nations in the world, why would you not vote those people back into power at the next elections? And that is exactly what has happened. The social contract has meant that you keep giving us growth and we will keep voting you back. Now, Singapore 2022, things are a little bit different because we have, excuse me, just one second. We have got to a stage where we have to talk about the next 50 years. And this is where some of the challenges come into play. Now that we are in the top 5 wealthiest nations in the world, well, what have you done for me lately, right? And it's difficult to have 7-8% growth, difficult to keep having rising incomes when you are already at this stage, and there's no playbook available. Remember, we followed the Japanese, the West German, Italian model of export-led growth. We started building manufacturing textiles, shoes, low value-added stuff. Now we are in the biotechnology industry. We are trying to attract talent and turn Singapore or parts of it into an entrepreneurial hub and so on and so forth. But there's no playbook anymore. Now we need to start fresh. Secondly, the population is now fully educated and literate. That means, and it's well traveled, that means that when people from here look at Australia, look at Europe, and they say, hey, we're as wealthy as those people, how come I still have to pay when I go at least a certain amount to the hospital and I visit the doctor? Or how come all these other things which are free in those countries I'm still paying for? The government keeps telling us we're wealthy. Well, these are the sort of questions that are coming up. Now, let me put that in perspective. Tax rates. If you are working in, this is not a cradle to grave democracy or welfare state. And there's a reason for that. If you are working in Europe or Australia, and I'm giving you hypothetical numbers because I don't know the exact numbers. If someone knows them, please feel free to share them in the chat. You are probably paying 40 to 50% income tax and other taxes on your income, particularly if you are a high income earner. In Singapore, if you are earning over $1 million a year, your maximum tax rate is 24%. Basically, you take home 76% of your pay. And that's why you also will not get socialized medicine. The majority of Singaporeans don't even pay any tax because they are below a very liberal threshold that is about maybe $2,400 US a month. They are at or below that threshold, particularly if you take into account tax deductions. So they don't pay any tax. We pay a goods and services tax, which is a value-added tax, but no income tax. Corporations, and Singapore is a huge destination for MNCs, for high value-added manufacturing and the petrochemical industry. The highest tax rate for corporations, 17%. So the debate, the discussion that Singapore now has to undertake, that conversation is, okay, do I want socialized medicine? And in return for that, am I happy to pay 30 to 40% income tax? Remember, education is basically heavily subsidized. Medical care for the low income is heavily subsidized. There's a lot of transfer of resources that is taking place between the high income earners and the low income earners through other means, including housing, including the value-added tax, and including taxes on things such as ownership of vehicles, transportation, etc. So that is one other reason. Thirdly, Singapore historically has been part underneath the US security umbrella. And this was part of that free world, communist world idea of the Cold War. As China's economic rise has come into play, China has overtaken the US as Singapore's larger trading partner. Okay, in fact, it is our largest trading partner, with Malaysia coming in second, although US is generally second or third. As the US and China have their own issues with each other, how does Singapore navigate a world in which this polarization is very apparent? Can we walk a fine line, maintain relations with China, with the US, maintain preferential trading arrangements, and so on and so forth? Those are questions that really have no answer at this point. The graying population, declining birth rates, Singapore's total fertility rate, which is the number of births per childbearing woman, just over 1. The replacement rate for populations is over 2, which means that citizens are slowly becoming extinct. We are also putting a great strain on the existing workforce to pay for an increasingly older population. Today, already, over about 20% of the population is over 65. And this is going to just continue as we go along. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing. And look at the news and you see the weather: drought some places, flood some places. Singapore is a little island, and as sea levels rise, Singapore could even go extinct. So climate change is in many ways an existential issue for Singapore. We have to do something about it, because otherwise we may lose much of our land. I should point out here that since 1965, 25% of Singapore's land is reclaimed land, which means that if you picked out an encyclopedia, and you'd have to do that, there was no Wikipedia in 1965. You picked out an encyclopedia and you saw Singapore's landmass, it would be 25% less than what Wikipedia will tell you today. It's probably about 550 square kilometers, thereabouts, versus today's 720 square kilometers. Because land is precious, land is scarce. That's why we're building up and we're building down, and of course everywhere in between. So those are some of the challenges that we are facing. Now, I have talked a lot. I've already talked for almost an hour, but I want to make sure that people, if they have questions, comments, please keep posting them. I will address them, because we are now coming to the slide where I can talk about some fun facts. So, but please, if you have questions, comments, let me know. Post them in the chat group. Absolutely, Elizabeth. But really, we are now wondering how long we can, because it's like the treadmill is just getting faster and faster. So as a nation, we also have to adjust our expectations. I use the example to some extent of Japan, where you've now reached a particular level of economic wealth and development. And now basically we should be happy to just focus on other things in our life, not necessarily only gear ourselves towards increasing growth, looking at that GDP number. Maybe it's time for us to look at some of the other softer things in life, building up our cultural spaces, building up looking at our own heritage, so on and so forth. So Peter, you asked, can you say about Singapore's reputation and as a nanny state with a considerable number of government regulations and restrictions on its citizens' lives? How did this come about? No doubt. Singapore has a reputation as an NEC, and to some extent, it's fair. Why do I say it's fair? Because Singapore is a kampong. Remember that word for village, right? Singapore is a village, which means that we operate much like a village because we are an Asian village. We have certain Asian values. Those values imply that community trumps the individual. No pun intended. It means that the community is more important than the individual. So we subordinate the individual's rights to the community. And that means that the leadership over the last 50 years, in order to get us to where we are today, has had to even micromanage many things. But you can micromanage on a small island like Singapore because of its population. It has grown dramatically, but when this journey started in the 1970s, 1960s, Singapore's population was about 1.5, 2 million, which means that micromanaging was a lot easier. And because over the last few decades, that a trust between the population and the leadership has been developed. And how is that trust developed? Simply because of the numbers I showed you. You've gone from being a state where you didn't have piped water, where your rivers were teeming with garbage, where you didn't have jobs, you didn't have medical care, you didn't have universal education, to one where all that is taken for granted, along with your quarterly or half-yearly vacations in the region. Your currency is one of the strongest in the region and in the world, allowing you to travel everywhere. So you really feel that, yeah, these guys have delivered. So I trust them because every time they tell us that they're going to do this, they do this. So micromanaging. Let's go into the chewing gum story, because chewing gum is a misunderstood story in Singapore. Chewing gum was banned after the Singapore subway system came into existence. Singapore's subway system came into existence in the late 1980s. And of course, for any city in the late 1980s, having a subway system, particularly what was then really a developing economy, a developing city, was a major thing of pride. We had a lot of pride in the fact that we were one of the few cities in the emerging world that had a subway system. Now, at the time, some youngsters who were mischievous, think back to our own childhood when we were young, when we were 15, 16, and we used to do things that we were not allowed to do simply because we were not allowed to do them. So what were these youngsters doing? They would take chewing gum, they would stick it on the doors of the subway trains. Excuse me. Now, these trains have sensors to check that whether the doors are shut or not. And if the doors do not completely shut, the trains are automatically halted until there is a safety check done to determine what's wrong, and so on and so forth. So imagine now you've got a subway system, and almost, I shouldn't say daily, but regularly during peak rush hour, your subway system is being disrupted because some juvenile is putting chewing gum on the doors of your subway trains, and that is holding up the entire network for 40 minutes to an hour all the time. So how do you deal with it? Well, there was a simple way. As the Prime Minister said, chewing gum is not that important, but maintaining efficiency and reliability is important. And if you really want to chew something, go chew a banana. If you can't think without chewing, chew a banana. Now, of course, I should add, you can't do that on the subway because eating and drinking is not allowed on Singapore's subway system. So the point I'm trying to make is that essentially, most people are quite happy with the level of supervision, if I can use that word, of their lives. And I can relate this to the CCTVs, We have 90,000 CCTV cameras that are set up by the police and the Home Office around the island. And that number is going up to 200,000 in the next 5 to 7 years. Most people don't see that as an issue because if you live in Singapore and you see that there are no ghettos anywhere, there is such a low level of crime that anyone, male or female, can walk in any part of the city alone any time of day or night. That is a trade-off or a compromise that Singaporeans are willing to make. It's fine for them to have CCTVs, which, by the way, are not monitored all the time. They're only retroactively monitored if crimes are committed. Because they say, well, my 8-year-old girl or boy can go out and play in the yard, and there's no danger that anyone's going to get hit with a stray bullet or anyone's going to kidnap them. And at 12 or 13, they can take the public transport to school on their own. I don't have to worry about anything. What's the worst that can happen? They'll get lost. They'll speak to a train operator, employee, and they'll find their way back. So big deal. They'll lose another half an hour or so. So yes, to some extent, it's a nanny state, but coming back to chewing gum in Singapore is much like recreational marijuana in many parts of Europe. It's legal to use it, but you start bringing it in commercial quantities, you'll have a problem. In fact, if you bring in over 500 grams of cannabis into Singapore, and it can be proven that it is over 500 grams, it's a mandatory death penalty. All right, and let's go back in time. Singapore, like China, at independence had a very large problem with opium because opium was the largest source of revenue for the colonial authorities. So opium use was rampant everywhere. Lori, can you purchase gum? Singapore signed a free trade agreement with the US in the early part of this century. And when the free trade agreement, the FTA, was being negotiated, the congressman from Chicago, from Illinois, who represented the interests of Wrigley's Gum, put a spanner in the works or threw a wrench in the works and basically said, we are not going to allow this free trade agreement to be signed until you include gum in the free trade agreement, which means that we should be able to export as much gum as we want, like any other commodity or product. Well, Singapore, of course, had already imposed its ban, so a compromise had to be reached, and this was a political compromise. So, Lori, you can thank your congressman for the fact that we can now purchase medicinal gum in Singapore, which means if it's nicotine gum, we can go to our local doctor and we can say, hey, I need nicotine gum. He will or she will give us a prescription. We can go to a pharmacy and we can buy it. There's no black market for gum here either. So if you are planning to visit Singapore, please bring your own supply of gum. Don't worry, no one is going to fine you. Just make sure you are not bringing it in commercial quantities. I have a friend who lives in LA, and I keep challenging him because he keeps bringing up this thing about gum and, you're a nanny state and this and that. So I tell him, look, please visit me in Singapore. When you are going through customs and immigration, chew gum like a camel or a cow. If you are asked to spit out your gum and you are searched and any gum that you have on you is taken away from you, I will pay for your entire stay in Singapore. And he has not yet taken me up on the challenge because, like I said, it's about personal consumption. So don't bring it in commercial quantities. Bring it in for personal use, and you will be fine. You also cannot go into dingy, dark streets and try and buy gum. Is not available. So, Lori, technically you can't, but as I said, it's like recreational marijuana in many European countries. It's fine for personal possession, but when you start talking about commercial quantity imports, no, it's not possible. So I hope that answers the question about nanny state, right? And just to reinforce that, those of you who come to Singapore or planning to come to Singapore, when you take a taxi in Singapore, talk to your taxi driver and find out what he or she thinks are the main issues facing them. Not one of them will talk about Singapore being a nanny state. They will bring up cost of living. They will say it's too expensive. My kids can't start families. And it's too expensive for me to buy this, to buy that, inflation, so on and so forth. And that's been the case for the last 10, 15 years. It's not about being a nanny state, because unless you are planning to go out and riot, burn a bus, or something like that, anything else, perfectly normal and legal. So people have other issues that they are dealing with, and freedom of expression, though not absolute, is very much respected, but it's not absolute. And I say it's not absolute because we have a Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, which means that you cannot hurt the feelings and sentiments of a particular religious group, including atheists and free thinkers. And also, there is in the works a Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act, which means ethnicities. So you cannot do things that essentially are discriminatory towards particular ethnicities or races. So, Laurie, you're right. You couldn't, but technically, but as I said, no one would stop you. I used to travel to Malaysia very regularly in the early part of the century, and one of the things that I used to always bring back were packets of gum to distribute into the office, the bubble gum and chewing gum, because some people like to chew gum. I don't know why. Personally, I'm quite happy that I can go to the cinema or anywhere else or bottom of my shoes and I don't find I have to scrape gum off from my shoes. Peter, yes, there is a Jewish community in Singapore. In fact, we have had some very prominent Jews historically. In 1955, as part of the independence movement, the first chief minister of Singapore, David Marshall, was a Singaporean Jew from a particular family that had migrated to Singapore from what is present-day Iraq. However, the Jewish community in Singapore has dwindled as many of them have migrated overseas. We have 2 functioning synagogues in Singapore. They are only open to the Jewish community, unlike other places of worship in Singapore that are open to all persons. The Jewish synagogues are only open to members of the Jewish community. And today, the Jewish community numbers about 5,000 to 7,000, and it is primarily foreigners who are living and working here. There are very few local Jews who live here permanently. Many of them still maintain ties with the country, but very few of them live locally. So, on that, some fun facts. Of course, please keep the comments, questions coming. I have already talked about land reclamation and tax rate, social welfare, but let me mention this Confucian filial piety and policy making. This relates again to the cradle to grave welfare state, because Singapore is not. As a result, it places the focus on individuals to take care of their own families, particularly seniors and elderly. And how does this translate into policy making? It translates into policy making because, let's say if I am going to give money to my elderly parents every month just for them to live, kind of like a pension, I can get a tax deduction on the amount that I give. So the government is encouraging me to take care of my parents through this tax deduction. Secondly, we go back to public housing. Remember, 80% of people live in public housing. If I apply for a flat or an apartment that is within a 2-kilometer radius of where my parents are living, I will get preferential treatment. Why? Because they know that if I'm within close distance, even possibly walking distance of my elderly parents, I will be able to better take care of them. So I will get preferential treatment in that area. In other words, I should take care of my parents because it's not the government's job to do so. Peter, you asked on restrictions. Basically, the synagogues here, the one that is used generally for services, the security has been handed out to the Israeli embassy. And the Israeli embassy brings with it a certain framework, which I guess is what they are used to implementing and operating in Israel. So they have a ultra high secure operation in their view, which of course is very different from the rest of Singapore. In fact, if you come to Singapore and you see, one of the things that you see is in the heart of Singapore on Orchard Road, which is our main shopping street. And I do have a tour, a walking tour next month on Orchard Road, where I'll just take you down Orchard Road. You'll see that the president's office is, which I guess in some ways is similar to the White House, we call it the Istana, has shares a boundary wall with a shopping mall. And you can basically go walk right up to the gate and you'll see that just a few police officers there, security. Because I mentioned security is very tight in Singapore in general. Gun control is very, very tight. So the laws on guns are very restrictive here. The last time that we had a criminal use a gun in a robbery was probably around 15 years ago. The last time someone was shot by a criminal using a gun was probably about 20 years ago. So gun control is very much a part of the reason why we in Singapore feel very safe. Because violent crime here generally means getting stabbed or getting beaten up by someone who's carrying a stick, or a parang, which is a kind of a chopper, a large knife used by people in the food industry. Another interesting story about this security. The current president of Singapore, Madam Halima Yacob, she's been in public service her entire life, and she's basically lived in public housing her entire adult life. When she became president, she refused to move from her public housing apartment. And she lived on, I think, the 12th or 13th floor of an apartment, not very far from where I'm staying, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers from here. And the security personnel basically pleaded with her, Madam, please move, because, you know, putting one police officer at the lift and one police officer on your floor, one outside your office, is not really safe enough. Anything could happen. And there are threats from time to time. So unless we seriously inconvenience all the other people living in your building, it's going to be very difficult for us to provide you with the level of security that we want to give you. So after they conducted a formal security review, and about 3 months into her presidency, they convinced her to move to another location where they feel they can provide her with adequate security befitting a head of state. Now, this speaks to a few things. One, not just the security, but also the fact that public housing cuts across the socioeconomic strata. Wealthy, not so wealthy, everyone lives in public housing. Of course, there's private housing. So if you are the co-founder of Facebook, that Brazilian gentleman, you'll probably, well, not probably, you own a house on an island that is off the southern coast of Singapore with your own swimming pool and so on and so forth, a villa, and that's where you live. And if you want to live in a very central part of Singapore, in a condominium with all sorts of facilities and infrastructure, you're welcome to do so. But public housing is high quality, lots of infrastructure, amenities, and facilities nearby. So I hope I've answered your question fairly, Peter, and happy to take any more questions and comments from people. And maybe some of you have different opinions on what you have heard. If you don't agree with something, please let me know. Every country is different. Every country has different social contracts, different compromises that society makes based on their own particular values and priorities. And I'm just sharing with you how it is here in Singapore. There's no right or wrong. It's, of course, something that communities have to decide for themselves. So thank you, Barbara, for that. If there are other things, because I've really talked a lot about these various aspects of Singapore society. If there's something which I missed, please let me know. Peter, you asked about public housing open to all. Okay, that's a great question because most Singaporeans will apply for public housing when they are in their 20s or 30s, just about the time that they're beginning their professional life and careers or even starting a family. There are upper level restrictions on income, which are quite generous, but you can bypass those restrictions if you buy from the resale market. So let me break that down for you. Generally, most 20, 30-year-olds, even those who are older, even if they are professionals, so let's say they're working in a bank or in a financial services, they will very easily be below the income threshold to apply for public housing. You have to be a Singapore citizen to apply and for public housing. If you are a permanent resident, which is similar to green card holder in the US, you can purchase public housing on the resale market. What is the resale market? When you own a public house and a public apartment it is mine. So if I own an apartment, it's mine, it's in my name, I have the title deed, but I own it leasehold for 99 years. That means that if I write a will and I leave that apartment to my pet dog, perfectly legal. My pet dog will get it until that 99-year period has run over. But once I obtain my apartment for 5 years, because I have got certain subsidies associated with that apartment, some are hidden, some are explicit. Once I get that apartment, after 5 years, I can sell it. And this is an easy way for some to make money because there are hidden subsidies in that apartment. What are these hidden subsidies? Primarily, it's the fact that since the government builds these apartments in large numbers and on land which it already owns, there are economies of scale in the construction. And very importantly, think about building a house yourself. You first have to buy the land. That land cost may be anywhere between 30 to 50% of the total cost of your house. But if the government owns the land to begin with, maybe it's reclaimed that land, maybe it was land that was swampland in the past that it's drained, then it doesn't have to pass on that cost of the land. It's already owned. So that's a huge subsidy. And so generally when these apartments are put forward on the resale market after 5 years, there's already a 30, 40, 50%, sometimes even more pop in the price. But once you sell, you have to buy. When you apply for an apartment, it will take you maybe 2 to 3 years for your turn to come up, and it's done randomly by a lottery. So sometimes you won't get an apartment in the neighborhood that you want. Sometimes you won't get an apartment that is exactly of the type that you want, so on and so forth. And you won't get it based on your timing. You'll get it based on the timing that the apartments are coming online. So I hope that answers your question. And thank you very much, Peter. Yes, Elizabeth, if I leave it to my pet, I don't have a pet dog. Talking about dogs, because we're living in communal settings, these apartments are, you saw the buildings, the apartments are very close to each other. We sometimes fondly refer to them as pigeonholes because they're pigeonholes in buildings. It means, I think, Peter, you asked about micromanaging. Here's another one for you. I can keep cats as pets. I can also keep dogs as pets, but the height of the dog has to be within a certain restriction because it has to be of a particular size. It can't be too big because we're living in a community. So we have to make sure that the community is comfortable and this dog is also not going to make too much noise. Noise disturbances are one of the key issues that residents often face living in this communal setup that I have explained to you. Such that, and it exploded, these noise issues during the lockdown period, because everyone's sitting at home. Many people are doing work from home. So all sorts of little things started to crop up because people were not spending their entire day at the office. So they suddenly realized that, well, secondhand smoke from the apartment next door is bothering me. The child next door who is taking piano lessons, that's bothering me. And someone has a child who plays basketball, that's bothering me. So all these things came to light. So again, we are having to adjust public housing. Newer public housing that is being developed with adaptations for one, the graying population. We are getting almost retirement villages that are coming up in certain towns. And two, the work from home concept is being built into the design of these apartments. As more and more people work from home, it means that the design requires some tweaking. All that is being done as we speak. So, Peter, to your point about micromanaging, dog size, right? If I live in a public housing, the dogs I own, I have to make sure they are legal to be owned here. Then, Pam, you asked, do you have to sell to someone of the same ethnicity? Excellent, Pam. You have obviously read up or been familiar with Singapore because remember that ethnic breakdown that I gave you earlier of 70% Singaporean, 15 Chinese Singaporean, 15% Malay Singaporean, 10% Indian Singaporeans, and then people like me who fall in an other category because we're not easy to put in a box. So we're the rounding off last 3% or so. In order to ensure that we do not have ethnic enclaves, so that we don't have one neighborhood that is going to be all Indian or all Filipino, because we've got a very large Filipino community of workers here. So renting of people from Myanmar and so on and so forth. So in order to avoid that, in public housing, only in public housing, the neighborhoods, we're not talking about buildings, we're talking about neighborhoods. So for example, where I am staying, we're talking about 5 or 6 buildings here. Within that building, this ratio of 70, 15, 10 should be maintained. So it's not that I can only sell to my own ethnicity. It's a function of what is going on in the resale market in the rest of the building. Because that ratio in the rest of the neighborhood, that ratio of 70, 15, 10 must be maintained in the neighborhood. All right. Katie, you ask, when you sell it, does the buyer get the 99 years? No, they start from where you left. So if I have owned an apartment for, say, 30 years or 40 years, and I sell it, that means that they will only have that apartment for the remainder of its life, which is 59 years if I owned it for 40 years. This impacts the resale value because, of course, 50 years is different from 99. If I'm a 20, 30-year-old, then I have a life expectancy now of probably over close to 90, and that 50 years may not cut it. So it affects the retail value. Katie, I see this OS equals R. I'm not sure I understand that. Perhaps you can explain that. Yes, of course. You talk about, Elizabeth, dogs and dog biting someone. That is a key component of that law. In fact, certain dogs, as probably is the case in the US and other parts of the world, when you take them for a walk in public spaces, they have to be muzzled. When I go for a walk in the Sembawang Park, which I will be doing in September, then there's a very clear sign that I show people of the dogs that are need to be muzzled while they are being walked in public. Powell, you asked about how are complaints handled in the neighborhoods. Powell, if I remember correctly, you're from Poland. I'm not sure how old you are, but think a little bit of the old communist style neighborhoods, okay? So you will have a neighborhood committee, which is formed of the residents, a residents committee. That could be your first call. It doesn't have to be. The residents committee is actually more for things like you walk around the neighborhood and see, okay, is it being properly maintained? Is it clean? Are the gardeners doing a good enough job manicuring and so on and so forth? But you could also take your complaint to them. I wouldn't do that. So depending on the nature of the complaint, it would go to different agencies or different entities. So let's say there is someone who is maybe blasting their stereo at 11 p.m. at night, and it is disturbing you because quiet hours in the neighborhood are from 7 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. 10:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. So if they are doing that, well, the first thing that most people would do is just call the police. Police will come and lecture them and tell them to turn down their volume. If the complaint is about, let's say, litter in the neighborhood, if you've been on my Not Crazy Rich Asians or any of my tours, you'll know that we like to keep Singapore clean and green. So if it's about litter, we can do several things. So we have what is called a One Service app on our phone, which addresses the most normal common complaints. That could be litter, it could be parking bicycles in incorrect places, it could be supermarket trolleys being left behind, so on and so forth. You basically just upload a complaint with a photograph on that app, and within a couple of days, it will be addressed. So it depends on the nature of your complaint as to who you will go. But there's a town council to which all of us have to pay funds every month based on the size of our apartment. So think of it as like a management fee. That town council is responsible for the common areas and for much of the infrastructure in the area. So they are generally the ones who are responsible for many of these things. So I hope that answers your question. Powell, if you have something more specific, I'll be happy to do that. Carol, we can all learn from everyone. Every society has pros and cons, and we are feeling our way through as well as we are moving forward. It's not perfect by any means, but it's one that has worked well for us in Singapore over the last 50, 60 years. So, good, good. And coming back to that point I made about the communist era Poland or even Eastern Europe in general, let's not forget that the People's Action Party, which is the party that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew helmed when he became Prime Minister, and that has been voted back into power every election since 1959, started life as a left-wing socialist party. That is one of the reasons why this focus on public housing was so important. Of course, it's very much a part of nation building as well, but it's also that left-wing socialist ideal. And if you look at the older housing estates, the older neighborhoods that were built in the 1960s and 1970s, you could almost mistake yourself for being in Belgrade or in Prague. The older buildings, the older parts of those cities where communist housing or style, how the communists had built housing. Because of course, We had to, at that point, learn about public housing from other parts of the world. And that probably was one of the examples that came to mind. Singapore is constantly trying to benchmark itself against best in breed globally in all sorts of things. I do a walk around the Marina Bay area, which many of you may be familiar with. It's that building with the boat on top, and you've got that bay that is located in that area. The size of that Marina Bay is not random. The URA, which is the Urban Redevelopment Authority, went and did research on many similar bays around the world to see what makes sense from the perspective of it's not too far, but it's also not so close that you can't, for example, take photos of it or you feel that it's on your head. And if any of you are from Baltimore, Maryland, or you have been to Baltimore, you should know that the Marina Bay, the size, the distance from one end of the bay to where the Marina Bay Sands is located is almost identical to the similar distance of the bay in Baltimore, because that was seen to be the bay that was most appropriate for us to size here in Singapore. And we are constantly doing this to learn from different parts of the world to try and make sure that that treadmill that I talked about, that we're running on that treadmill to to get ahead, to stay on top, that we do that. Because the minute that you start to fall behind, there are always competitors all around you for many different things. So we have a district in the west of Singapore where the Jurong Industrial Estate, where industrialization first started, called One North. And that district is, part of it has been zoned as the Jurong Innovation District. So that's where things like autonomous vehicles are being experimented with, where all sorts of other new innovative technologies are being experimented with, where entrepreneurs are given office space at a subsidized rate in order to start their buildings, where in fact even entrepreneurs can apply to get budgets to start their businesses based on business plans, things like that. So the idea is you've got to keep moving, got to get ahead. Singapore has to keep reinventing itself as it moves ahead. So I think this has been a hopefully interesting and also informative session for you. I'm happy to take more questions if you have any. And of course, those of you who have left tips for me, thank you very much. It's much appreciated. It always helps if you can leave a tip, because it allows me to focus on producing more content for this platform. And those of you who can, please do. If you can't, a review or a rating will always be helpful as well, or content on Facebook. Peter, Singlish, yes, of course. Singlish is part of the Singaporean identity, right? Singlish is you can say the unofficial official language, and it is an amalgamation, primarily English, but it is an amalgamation of several Chinese dialects. So dialects such as Hokkien, Teochew, even Hakka, some of the smaller dialects, Malay, and Tamil, which are other official languages in Singapore. 4 official languages. English, which is the universal language, so all education from primary to tertiary level in English. Malay, which is the national language, so our national anthem is in Malay. Tamil, which is another official language, and then Mandarin. So Singlish basically takes all those languages and forms a functional language which all Singaporeans can learn and talk with each other. And it's the common colloquial tongue. So if you visit Singapore, and I've told you English is an official language, and English is also the language of education. If you visit Singapore and you tell your taxi driver, okay, take me to such and such hotel, and you can't understand his answer, even though he's speaking in Singlish, it's in English, it's because it's probably Singlish that he is using. And because we are so used to speaking Singlish and thinking that everyone understands that English here, it'll take you a few days to realize that everyone who you are talking to is actually speaking English, but it's our own form of English, Singlish. All right, so Singlish now has its own dictionary. You can look it up online. It also has differentiations between Mandarin, between English, Malay, and Tamil. Many phrases, common phrases, are literally translated into English and their meaning taken based on the original phrase. So, one amusing phrase is got no ball. Got no ball is a literal translation of the original in Mandarin, and it literally means that you don't understand what that person is saying, because that's apparently a way in which that is expressed in Mandarin. Uh, Katie, how many of the outlying islands are occupied? Good question. Singapore is an amalgamation of about, I'm talking only about Singapore here, 63 different islands. And some of the bigger islands are not occupied by population as much as they are used for commercial purposes, as well as even as garbage landfills. So Sentosa is an island that you may have heard of. It's in the south of the island, which is basically a resort island. People live there. It is also where Universal Studios is, where we have a sea aquarium. It's kind of a playground for Singapore. Very easy to get to, connected by train, by subway to Sentosa. That's one. Then you have Pulau Ubin, which is you can say an island that is being conserved, that people go there for biking, for recreation. It's a natural reserve. So if you want to see the macaque monkeys, you want to see butterflies as big as birds, you want to do some bird watching, or you want to look at the marine life in the surrounding marine shelf, you can go to Pulau Ubin. Then we have Pulau Bukom, which is an island that is almost exclusively devoted to the petrochemical industry. So Singapore is the largest bunkering hub in the world. Bunkering basically means we're a petrol station for ships. So we refuel these vessels, and much of that is stored and produced refined in Pulau Bukom, as well as in Jurong Island. Then when you do your basic military training as a national serviceman, you do that first 6 months on an island that is exclusively used for military training. And you can't take your smartphones in there for the first few months. You have to use the really old Nokia phones. Remember those phones? That is where you do your BMT, or basic military training. So, and then we have that Pulau Semakau, which is the garbage of Eden. It's an island that is used as a landfill, but you can also do tours there to look at marine life and to look at birds, because it's not really a traditional type of landfill. It's also an island that is being reclaimed based on the garbage that is being used, sent over there after its incineration. You can look that up as well, Pulau Semakau, and see how we are trying to basically create more land using our garbage. So, hope that answers your question. Any other comments or questions before I let you go? Peter, recent repeal of the colonial era law criminalizing sex between men caused much public reaction. It's a good question. I would have to say that people are still digesting the news, and everyone, of course, is wondering what next. The LGBTQ community has its own thoughts and, of course, has to sit back and decide how they are going to try and move their concerns forward. The uh, the religious right, which is on the other extreme, is also digesting what this means in real, actual terms. And of course, the bulk of the population, to some extent, it's kind of a non issue because it really, practically speaking, doesn't change very much. This law criminalizing sex is kind of a red herring in the sense that before the law, you could look up gay tourism to Singapore and find gay clubs, gay bars, and all that sort of stuff because it was, and gay tourism Singapore being promoted as a gay friendly destination by the Singapore Tourism Board, which is a government agency. So, in many ways, for most of the people, it really hasn't changed very much. Having said that, it's generally a conservative population, and everyone is sitting back to see what this means and digesting the news. So I think that's a question that will probably be better answered in a year or so from now when we start to see the reactions become more concrete and when we start to see what this actually means. As an interesting aside, the Supreme Court in India yesterday issued a proclamation or issued a judgment in which they widened the definition of family from beyond the typical definition of family. Singapore adheres to common and civil law that was left behind by the British as colonial administrators, and the Indian case law, which also derives itself from this common and civil law, is of particular significance to Singapore, and that is reflected in the fact that the striking down by the Indian Supreme Court of the same section in India had a role to play in the government's decision to repeal it, in the timing of the government's decision. So when the Indian Supreme Court just 2 days ago or yesterday passed this judgment broadening the definition of family beyond typical definitions, it has an impact on Singapore, and people will certainly within the legal community be looking to see what that means for Singapore and for Singapore's constitutional law. So I hope that answers your questions. We can come back to this, I think, in a year or so and see how things have developed. So unless there are any other comments or questions, maybe I will call it a morning for me, or an evening or afternoon or morning for you, depending on wherever you are. I want to thank all of you who stayed with me during this session, and I hope it was useful. And I will try and do this more often, maybe focusing more, diving deeper into some particular aspects of Singapore, whether that be housing or economic policy or so on and so forth. So again, if you can leave a tip, it will be wonderful. If you can, if you can't, please leave a review or a rating. If you can't do that either, no problem. I'm happy to have you along for the ride. All right. So thank you very much, everyone. Remember, I've got a tour at the Sembawang Beach Park where I literally take you to the coast of Singapore where we can see Malaysia, wave to Malaysia across, and also a walk down Orchard Road, Singapore's famous shopping street, coming up in the next week or so. All right, so thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day, great evening. And as we are coming up to the weekend, great weekend to you all. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.